Hello and welcome to Eye on Africa here on France 24. I'm Clarisse Fortuné. First, the stories making headlines across the continent. M23 rebels continue to make significant advances in eastern Congo. They seized the strategic town of Minova, a key supply route to the provincial capital, Goma. And what will be the United States' involvement in the conflict with Donald Trump now in power? The Biden administration had been a vocal critic of Rwanda's backing of M23 rebels. President Donald Trump, who left once again the Paris Agreement on climate, will discuss what it means for the continent, which emits a fraction of the world's CO2. So we start the program in the DR Congo, where the M23 rebel group seized the eastern town of Minova. M23, which has been making significant advances in recent weeks. Government forces fought to secure Minova, but were eventually forced out. The town is a transit point for many agricultural goods heading to Goma, about 45 kilometers away. Laurent Bersecher has the story.
Carrying children and luggage on their backs, on foot or by motorbike, thousands of refugees flocked to the city of Nzulo, 20 kilometers north of Goma. Most of them came from Minova, a town of 65,000 inhabitants recently seized by the M23 rebels. Others hailed from even further away and have been on the run for weeks.
I come from Karuba. The M23 forced us to flee to Minova. We were just starting to settle there, but now we've had to flee again.
A regional commercial hub, Minova was the latest town to fall to M23 fighters in recent weeks. Since its capture, thousands have flocked towards Goma, North Kivu's regional capital and one of the region's few cities still under the army's control. Those who stopped in Nzulo err through crowded streets, unsure of where to go next. Here, no structures are in place to accommodate the refugees, and local residents are starting to fear the influx could stretch the city's resources to the limit.
We welcome everyone, but this presence is making people paranoid. Residents fear starvation. We don't farm and we live off the lake. But with the capture of Minova, access to Lake Kivu will be limited, and that makes us very worried.
Since the start of the year, M23 fighters backed by the Rwandan army have ramped up their offensive, capturing several strategic towns in North and South Kivu and slowly closing in on Goma. Over 230,000 people have been displaced by the fighting in the past 3 weeks, according to the United Nations.
So after being sworn in as US president again, Donald Trump wasted no time in using his powers to act on a range of policy priorities. The relationship with Africa not being one of them. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, there is uncertainty over the policy Trump will take, particularly toward the conflict in the east. The Biden administration was a vocal critic of Rwanda's military intervention in North Kivu and its backing of M23 rebels. Emmett Livingston in Kinshasa has more.
The administration of US President Joe Biden took an active interest in the Democratic Republic of Congo in areas ranging from infrastructure investments to the environment and conflict. For example, Biden oversaw the launch of the Lobito Corridor project, which aims to revitalize a huge railway line stretching from the cobalt mining areas of Congo all the way to Angola's Atlantic coast. The Biden administration was also active in efforts to protect Congo's rainforest, leaning on the government in Kinshasa to scrap oil exploration in protected areas. But the Biden administration's impact was particularly notable in the conflict in eastern Congo. Many in Congo are deeply suspicious of the US, but Washington was among the first major world governments to condemn Rwanda for sending troops into eastern Congo in support of M23 rebels. Biden's administration attempted to calm tensions, brokering a humanitarian ceasefire in July and encouraging the Congolese and Rwandan governments to dialogue. That policy has mostly failed, however, with the conflict in eastern Congo back in full swing. Kinshasa has long pushed, unsuccessfully, for the US and other Western states to sanction Rwanda. And now that Donald Trump is in office, the question for many in Congo is what stance he will take on the conflict in the east. Will the new administration exert pressure on Rwanda, or rather look the other way? For now, the jury is still out.
And meanwhile, in Kenya, President William Ruto's strong ties with Joe Biden might not play in his favor, but the country's new designation as a major non-NATO ally and its involvement in sending police to Haiti could help maintain solid relations with the U.S. Department of Defense. Our Kenya correspondent Olivia Bizot provides insights into what Trump's return might mean for Kenya.
Trump doesn't always talk about Africa very positively. But surprisingly, during his first term in office, he actually launched a series of initiatives aimed at improving trade relations with many African countries. One key development here was the beginning of negotiations for a free trade agreement with Kenya, along with many other programs aimed at boosting trade relations with other African countries.
Prosper Africa it's a program which was also carried on during the Biden administration to facilitate trade and investment partnerships, to connect more African businesses and more, in the context of Kenya, more Kenyan businesses to the US, and those businesses that want to invest from the United States in Kenya. It was a platform for connections, and that was something that was introduced during the Trump administration. So I foresee that it will, again, not be gloom and doom completely, particularly for the trade and investment space.
While trade ties may improve, there is concern that other sectors could take a hit. Many are afraid that the US will withdraw troops from Somalia, where they've been fighting the terror group Al-Shabaab, and many in Kenya are afraid that the country will become more vulnerable to attacks at the border. Kenya's health sector could also take a hit. The Biden administration has invested heavily in Kenya's healthcare services, and many are afraid that Trump's return could threaten progress made in areas like abortion rights and HIV/AIDS.
So one of the executive orders signed by President Donald Trump since he took office was to pull the US out of the Paris Agreement on climate for a second time. He also signed an order instructing federal agencies to reject international climate finance commitments made under the previous administration. The decision comes just after 2024 was named the hottest year on record. Let's bring in David Nicholson. He's a Chief Climate Officer at Mercy Corps. Welcome, David Nicholson. So let's start. What does the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement mean for African countries?
This decision has profound implications for Africa. This is a continent that is the least responsible for the climate crisis and is already experiencing some of its most profound and serious impacts. Any step back from climate commitments among the major emitters, could set a really dangerous precedent and have a knock-on effect, leading to others to consider walking back their own commitments. This seriously undermines efforts to limit global warming, which in turn will exacerbate extreme weather events and lead to things like increased global food insecurity, water insecurity, and migration. The US is also a really significant source of climate finance for less wealthy nations. And African nations, many of whom are really leading the charge on innovative ways to adapt to this crisis, will have to seek this funding elsewhere. And I think we all saw at the end of COP29, the global community is already not meeting the demands for climate finance, and this sets us back further.
And it's harder to understand this decision because 2024 has been particularly hard for African countries.
Yes, we're already seeing the devastating impacts of climate change across the continent. We saw severe drought spells across the Horn of Africa in the last 3 years, which led to severe food insecurity and water insecurity, can lead to people migrating and causing conflict. And in other parts of the continent, and recently we're seeing devastating floods that can, and as we're seeing on your screen here, can really devastate communities and undermine efforts for people to not just cope and adapt, but, thrive, which is what people want to do.
So what does the rest of the world do now?
So we're now in a position where other countries are going to have to step up and take the lead. The US has been an important leader in global climate negotiations at various points throughout the last few decades. Global US leadership has been important, and we need other countries to step up and take on that role to ensure that negotiations and agreements continue to drive climate finance to those who need it most, while also reaching agreements for rapid decarbonization. We're also going to have an increased funding gap. And, this is a place where things like private philanthropy can step up to help to fill that gap and provide the kind of catalytic financing we need to encourage private investment to come in to help us solve this climate crisis.
Thank you very much for your analysis. David Nicholson, the Chief Climate Officer at Mercy Corps. Thank you very much for your input. And case in point, one of the case studies is the Central African Republic. The town of Boali, situated near Bangui, is known for its rich water resources. But in recent weeks, the impacts of climate change have dried up the main river that feeds the town. This has led to a crisis affecting not only fishing, but also the local economy. This report by Pacom Pabenji and Tom Kennedy.
Fidel has been casting his nets from his canoe for hours without success. Things didn't work out for him today. He's caught almost nothing.
The climate has changed. It's cold. We don't have enough fish anymore. Fishing doesn't work anymore. When the water dries up, the fish leave, and that makes things difficult for us.
The destruction of the forests has accelerated the impacts of climate change. The main river that supplies Boali with fish has dried up and it is too cold. But community leaders are not giving up. They're holding meetings to raise awareness around the impact of deforestation.
We never stop raising awareness among our brothers in Boali and all over the country, especially the young people. If we want to have our daily bread, we mustn't cut down trees and burn forests, because that leads to climate change and takes away what we need to live.
Boali's waterfalls make it one of the most famous tourist sites in the Central African Republic. But today, visitors and even the town's inhabitants can't hide their dismay at the staggering rise in the price of fish.
This is 18,000 CFA francs. And the last price is, what, 17,000 CFA? I think it's still too expensive. The price is really very high compared to before.
The impact of this crisis is not limited to fishing. Boali's economy, which is largely based on the aquatic sector and tourism, has also been affected. A situation the government is striving to address to bring Boali back to its former radiant reputation.
And this report concludes our edition of Eye on Africa. Thank you for watching.